You have to set the story you know aside, Sophia. I think that's one of the most important lines in this novel, Kaylnn Bayron's Cinderella is Dead, which I'm going to talk about in this video. First off, I was actually inspired to read this book by an article in Humanities by Michelle Anyerbach and Vanessa Jusen. I don't know if I pronounced their last names correctly. Probably not. They're Dutch, and I don't speak Dutch, so I apologize if that's wrong. But their article is entitled, "You Have to Set the Story You Know Aside, Constructions of Youth, Adulthood, and Senescence in Cinderella is Dead." I'm going to put a link to that in the description below. Check that out. Read this book, then check it out, or check it out and then read this book. Very, very good stuff. This is an adaptation of the Cinderella story in a way. It's really a dystopian young adult adaptation of the Cinderella story. What's interesting, or one of the things that's really interesting about this novel, is the Cinderella story has become a kind of theological touchstone for the kingdom of Marseille, which is where this is set. In a way, this is like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. This is a theocratic society in which much of the energy of the theocratic control is about gender relationships, control of women, but also control of LGBT sexualities and identities. So we get very early in the book, actually in the second chapter, very short chapters, by the way, we get this list of decrees that govern this society. 1. A minimum of 1 pristine copy of Cinderella will be kept in every household. 2. The annual ball is a mandatory event. 3 trips are permitted, after which attendees are considered forfeit. 3. Participants in unlawful, unsanctioned unions will be considered forfeit. 4. All members of households in Marseille are required to designate 1 male of legal age to be head of household, and his name will be registered with the palace. All activities undertaken by any member of the household must be sanctioned by head of household. 5. For their protection, women and children must be in their permanent place of residence by the stroke of 8 each night. 6. A copy of all applicable laws and decrees, along with an approved portrait of His Majesty, will be displayed in every household at all times. We find out a little bit later how seriously these theocratic laws are taken when our main character, Sophia, is out with her friends Liv and Aaron. Incidentally, Sophia and Aaron have a lesbian relationship, which they have to keep very, very secret because rule number 3 would be participants in unlawful, unsanctioned unions will be considered forfeit. We do find out what exactly forfeit means. Basically, you get sent to the palace, where either they send you out to these sort of concentration camp, work farm, re-education facilities, or something else happens to you. And we don't yet know what that thing is, but we find out later in the book. So Liv has bought a magic wand because she had gone to the ball the year before. Basically, the ball is a sort of, not to put too fine a point on it, it's a slave auction for young women, effectively. Starting at age 16, young women are required to go to the ball, where essentially the men of the kingdom, men of any age, come and they can essentially bid on them to become their wives. So it's essentially a slave auction. And as we know from the rules, from number 2, 3 trips are permitted, after which attendees are considered forfeit. So if you go to the ball 3 times and nobody wants to marry you, off to either work camp or a worse fate, which I will tell you about. So Liv has already gone once. This is going to be her second trip, so she's not really in a good place. So she's bought this magic wand to try and help. It says, Liv points the stick at me and gives it a flick. She frowns. I always hoped that one day I'd develop some magical powers. I guess today is not that day. I pat her arm. No one has seen any kind of magic since Cinderella's time. I doubt it even exists anymore. A hush falls over them, and they exchange worried glances. Of course it exists, Aaron says in a whisper. You know the story as well as anyone. If we are diligent, if we know the passages, if we honor our fathers, we might be granted the things Cinderella was. And if we do all those things and nothing happens, no fairy godmother appears, no dress, no shoes, no carriage, then what? Do we still believe it? Don't question the story, Sophia. Liv steps closer to me. Not in public, not anywhere. Why, I ask. You know why, Aaron says in a low tone. You must put your faith in the story. You must take it for what it is. And what is it, I ask? The truth, Aaron says curtly. So again, this is a theocratic society. I mean, this is very much the same as Gideon in Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale. This is a society in which Holy Scripture is unquestionable. And we see this in other theocratic societies. I mean, Saudi Arabia, for instance, Afghanistan under the Taliban, even in far-right evangelical communities and things like that here in the U.S. Theocratic law is not to be questioned. And that's just what it is. Now, in this book, we can see that as a ridiculous thing because it's the story of Cinderella, which we all, as people who live in the real world, know to be a fairy tale. We know that it's not real, etc., etc. But if we apply the same logic, which from a humanist perspective, from a secularist, from an atheist perspective is perfectly legitimate, to the Bible, for instance, then this idea that it's somehow incumbent upon us to live our lives according to scriptural values or something like this becomes much more problematic. So that's what we get. We go through. Basically, Sophia spends a good amount of time questioning this society. It is remarkable that she's not already in prison for the amount of questioning that she does, and also for the fact that she's having a lesbian relationship in a society where same-sex relationships are absolutely prohibited, although she does also meet a number of other LGBT people. She goes to the ball. She hates this idea. She really, really does not want to, but her parents and everybody else around her feels unable to challenge this system. She goes to the ball. Some shit goes down. Basically, she is going to be married off to somebody who she absolutely detests and who she knows will physically abuse her, because there's a lot of domestic abuse in this book. It's extraordinarily unpleasant to read in some places. But there's a lot of physical abuse that's justified by this society's theology and by the patriarchal values embodied in it. And so she ends up basically escaping. She escapes out into sort of the wilderness at the edge of the city. Then something very strange happens. Liv had actually, because her family didn't have money for a beautiful gown and hair done up and fancy makeup and what all. The king, King Manfred, basically singled her out and had her dragged out of the ball, and nobody knew what happened to her. While Sophia is out sort of hiding in the woods at the edge of the city, Liv's body is dumped in a ditch by some palace guards, and Sophia is nearby. And it says here, the steep slope leads down into a ditch where a few inches of water have gathered. Lying there is a person. My breath catches. I recognize her dress. Eyes that once sparkled with laughter, and a mouth that once whispered silly jokes are open wide, caught in a scream. I cup my hand over my mouth to stifle the nausea. My dear Liv, I have never seen a dead body. I don't know what it should look like, but what I see seems foreign. Liv's hair, once brown, is now white as snow. Her skin is shriveled and ashen gray. Her arms are drawn up in front of her, her hands rigid, fingers curled into claws. So we don't really know what's happened, but Liv appears to have aged unnaturally. Keep that in mind. So Sophia's wandering around in the wilderness, trying to figure out what to do, when Constance comes upon her. Constance is just sort of living this vagabond life outside the control of the authorities, because she is the descendant of one of the wicked stepsisters of the Cinderella story, and she reveals to Sophia that, in fact, the official version of the Cinderella story is a horrific distortion of what really happened, and that Cinderella and the stepsisters were actually all on the same side against Prince Charming, who was, again, this sort of horrific autocrat who tried to instill this deeply patriarchal and theocratic system, and did in fact succeed in that. Sophia and Constance basically join forces. They are going to find some way to destroy King Manfred and liberate particularly the women of Marseille, but liberate really all of the people of Marseille. They don't know exactly how they're going to do this. Constance's family has been engaged in this struggle for some 200 years, and they've not so far been successful. But this is the objective. They are essentially fighting to liberate this society. Eventually they develop the plan that they're going to go to the middle of the White Woods to see if they can find the remains of the fairy godmother. When they get to the middle of the White Woods, in this fairly horrific, sort of almost German expressionist type wilderness, they find a woman named Amina, who claims to be the original fairy godmother. She claims to be this woman, and she's able to do magic, etc., etc. And what she tells them is actually that, she tells them, Marseille has only ever had one ruler since the time of Cinderella, Amina says. There's no city in the Forbidden Lands producing potential heirs to the throne. Charming is Manfred. Manfred is Charming. Now, there have been officially 4 rulers, from Charming, then an additional 2, and then King Manfred. Amina reveals to them that, in fact, it's the same man, and he's somehow found a way to unnaturally prolong his life and return himself to youth. She gives them a version of events regarding what happened at the time of Cinderella, where she was the fairy godmother. She essentially helped Charming ascend the throne, then found out how terrible he was, and then tried to help Cinderella overthrow him, tried to help her assassinate him, essentially. But when Charming actually fell in love with Cinderella, Amina thought that maybe if Cinderella fell in love with him, he could change for the better. That did not happen. He got worse and worse and worse, in part because Amina drugged Cinderella with a love potion that lasted for about a month, and then Cinderella came to her senses and was like, I hate you. You're terrible. You suck. You also killed my parents, so fuck you. I don't want to be married to you. So Charming did not take well to that. And actually that becomes one of the things later on. In the final sort of very lengthy climactic conflict between Sophia and Manfred. So basically what we learn is that Manfred is able to drain the life out of young women and basically vampirically absorb their essence in order to keep himself young. And every 100 years or so, he just absorbs a bunch of life energy. He lets himself age, so he gets older and older and older. It seems like a natural progression. Then he gets a massive dose of people's life forces, comes back young, and is like, hey, it's me, new king, totally not the same guy. And because over 100 years, everybody who knew him when he was young is now dead, he gets away with it. So what Sophia tells him, or what she says to him, basically he's trying to absorb her life essence. She's resisting, and she says, you bring them here to fill the void Cinderella left in your blackened heart, I say defiantly. Your bitterness, this anger, it only comes from having your heart broken. Was that her crime, that she didn't love you? I deserved her love, he screams. That's a very interesting line. He is unhinged, his eyes wild. I took her out of her mundane existence and made her a queen. She should have loved me all her life for it. You couldn't control her. You couldn't force her to love you as you loved her. I suddenly understand what's driving him. He's convinced himself that he was entitled to Cinderella's love. He cannot see how his own actions turned her against him. Now, this is a very interesting thing in terms of patriarchal control of women and the contemporary incel phenomena. This idea of that feeling entitled to women sexually or romantically or interpersonally or whatever it is, that is at the heart of patriarchal power and domination, right? And Manfred, for all his power and authority and control within this society, is essentially an incel. His psychology is shaped by this feeling that he is entitled to women or a particular woman, realistically women in general, though, because he does absorb the life essence of women. So his psychology is shaped by this thwarted sense that he is entitled to women and that Cinderella should have loved him, that he was somehow deserving of her love regardless of whether or not he had done anything to be worthy of it or anything or any consideration of her as a person and her desires. So we go on and on. It's an extremely long climactic battle, etc., etc. Basically because Manfred can't die. At one point, Sophia stabs him in the throat and he laughs. And that's actually a pretty chilling moment. But what we eventually learn, because there was an episode earlier where Amina brought back Cinderella's spirit from the dead, allowed her spirit to briefly inhabit her corpse, and to give them a little bit of not necessarily super useful advice. We learn fairly late in the climactic battle that Amina is actually Charming's mother, and that he had died and she brought him back. And one of the principles of necromancy, at least in this book, is the conjurer is bound to the raised corpse until death. So part of the reason that Manfred is able to sustain himself and to keep coming back is because Amina is alive. And as long as she is alive, he is invulnerable to harm. And so Amina, who had not been forthright with Constance and Sophia about her maternal relationship with Manfred, and about the fact that she had that as long as she survived, Manfred would survive, she does end up killing herself in order to basically turn Manfred mortal so that Sophia can destroy him. With Manfred dead, and actually the castle burned down, there's the option of a brave new world here. And there's an interesting final confrontation. Because basically Sophia and Constance and Emil, who's another member of this sort of resistance sect who had been captured, basically they sort of gather a bunch of the people around and announce that Manfred is dead and that this theocratic regime, this authoritarian regime, was over. So Constance is speaking here. She says, "Everything Sophia said is true." Constance says, "My family is descended from Gabrielle, Cinderella's sister, and she was not the monster the king made her out to be. None of them were. You've been lied to, but you have a chance to change things, right here, right now. I see fathers with tears in their eyes. You can keep your girls safe from harm, I say, and more important, they can be allowed to keep themselves from harm. These girls don't want to be here tonight. Look at your children, your friends, your wives, and your daughters. Don't do what is right because they hold those titles. Do what is right because they are people. Make a choice to change things." So this is the moment of social transformation. And there is a final conflict because there's a group of men who sort of coalesce and essentially demand that they continue to get to run things the way that things have been run in the past, at which point the girls basically knock them out. And so we get, in the final chapter, we have Sophia's sort of reflections on this transformation, and we get the impression that this has opened up opportunities for a more just society in which people get to control their own fates and love who they love.